On September 16, 1581, the sun sets over the main square of Neumarkt, in the heart of Bavaria. A crowd gathers in a circle around a wooden structure that rises like a profane altar in the center of the square. On this structure awaits a gigantic oak wheel, silent and foreboding. At the edge of the crowd, children are hoisted onto their fathers' shoulders to witness the spectacle about to unfold. Everyone knows they are about to experience something extraordinary: the execution of the most feared man in the entire region. Guards appear, escorting a figure who barely seems human anymore. Decades of heinous crimes have transformed Peter Niers into a dark legend that haunted the streets and forests of Germany. His face, marked by scars and the cruelty of a life dedicated to evil, shows only contempt for the crowd watching him. In a few moments, he will face one of the most brutal execution methods humanity has ever devised. He will be broken on the wheel, with every bone in his body systematically shattered before being burned alive. But how does a man become such a horrific monster that his death becomes an unprecedented spectacle of horror? The answer takes us to the blood-soaked streets of 16th century Europe, where Peter Niers carved his name into history as one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. The story of Peter Niers begins in the fog of a neglected childhood and extreme poverty. Born sometime around the mid-16th century in Franconia, he grew up in a time when Europe was torn apart by religious wars, famine, and plague. Orphaned early, he wandered the streets as a beggar before discovering he had a talent for something far darker: murder. Niers's first crimes were driven by the basic necessity of survival. He ambushed lone travelers on deserted roads, killing them for a few coins or a piece of bread. But what began as desperation soon transformed into something far more sinister. Peter discovered that he enjoyed killing. He didn't merely tolerate the violence necessary for his robberies, he relished it, prolonged it, refined it. For over 40 years, Niers terrorized the trade routes between Franconia and Bavaria. His victims were primarily merchants, pilgrims, and travelers unfortunate enough to cross his path. But Peter was no ordinary bandit. He developed sophisticated torture methods, keeping his victims alive for days while subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. Records from the time describe Peter Niers as a man of medium build but impressive physical strength. His eyes were said to be soulless, and his hands, perpetually blood-stained, trembled constantly, not from fear, but from a perverse excitement that only violence could satisfy. He traveled with a small band of equally depraved accomplices, but it was always he who led the attacks and decided the fate of the victims. What made Peter Niers particularly terrifying was not only the number of his victims, estimated at over 500 people over the course of his criminal career, but the ritualistic nature of his crimes. He developed a morbid obsession with cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims and keeping other pieces as macabre trophies. Reports from the time mention that he always carried a leather sack containing fingers, ears, and other human fragments. Even more disturbing was Niers's fervent belief that eating human flesh granted him supernatural powers. This belief led him to develop a particular preference for children, whose hearts he devoured while still warm, convinced that this would make him invincible. Witnesses who survived his attacks reported seeing him whisper incantations during his cannibalistic rituals. Peter Niers's grim reputation spread rapidly throughout the region. Parents used his name to frighten disobedient children. Travelers altered their routes to avoid the areas where he was known to operate. Ever higher bounties were offered for his capture, but he always managed to escape, as if protected by diabolical forces. Local authorities organized several expeditions to hunt him down, but Peter knew every path, every cave, every hiding place in the region's forests. He had turned the territory into an extension of his own malevolence, building a network of informants among petty criminals and desperate people whom he protected in exchange for their loyalty. For decades, Peter Niers remained a bloody shadow looming over the region. But even the most cunning monsters eventually make mistakes, and Peter's mistake was underestimating the determination of one man, Georg Ammann, a magistrate from Neumarkt, whose family had been brutally murdered by Niers years earlier. Ammann dedicated his entire life to capturing the serial killer. He studied Niers's patterns, mapped his movements, and infiltrated his network of contacts with spies. In August 1581, he finally succeeded in cornering Peter Niers in a remote forest hut, where the criminal was hiding after yet another massacre. The capture of Peter Niers was an event that shook the entire region. As the news spread, crowds flocked to Neumarkt to see the man who had become a legend of terror. Shackled in the city prison, he continued to exhibit disturbing behavior, laughing without reason and muttering incomprehensible words. The trial of Peter Niers was more a formality than a proper judicial proceeding. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Hundreds of witnesses, dozens of survivors willing to recount their horrors, and the macabre trophies found in his possession. But what truly sealed his fate was his own confession. During the interrogation, Peter not only admitted to his crimes, but described them in gruesome detail, apparently proud of his work. He spoke of specific torture techniques, the taste of human flesh, and the rituals he believed gave him power. His accounts were so horrifying that some of those present in the courtroom vomited. The verdict was announced with solemn grandeur. Peter Niers was to be executed by the method of the wheel, but not in an ordinary manner. Given the magnitude of his crimes, the authorities decided he would endure a particularly prolonged and brutal version of this method. First, he would be tortured with red-hot pincers. Then his bones would be systematically broken. Finally, he would be burned alive while still conscious. The execution was scheduled for September 16th, a date that became a local holiday of justice. In the days leading up to the event, pilgrims and curiosity seekers traveled from distant cities to witness the end of the man who had terrorized the region for so long. On the morning of the execution, Peter Niers was brought to the center of Neumarkt's main square. The crowd that gathered was so large that the authorities needed additional guards to maintain order. Street vendors circulated, offering food and drink, turning the event into a macabre fair. The execution equipment had been specially constructed for the occasion. The oak wheel, over 2 meters in diameter, was mounted on a structure that allowed it to rotate slowly. Nearby, braziers glowed with pincers and branding irons heated to a red-hot glow. A pile of firewood awaited the final act. Peter Niers was stripped and bound to the wheel with thick ropes. Even at this moment, he showed neither fear nor remorse. His eyes remained empty, as if this horrific reality were just another of the nightmares he had inflicted on hundreds of others. The torture began with the red-hot pincers, applied to specific parts of his body. First the feet, then the hands, then the chest. With each application, his skin sizzled, and the smell of burning flesh spread across the square. Peter screamed, but his cries seemed more from rage than pain, as if he were furious at being unable to escape this situation. After an hour of torture with the hot irons, the main part of the execution began: the breaking of the bones. The executioner, an experienced man specially hired for the occasion, started with the fingers of the hands and feet. One by one, each bone was carefully broken with a heavy hammer, producing a dry sound that the crowd listened to in morbid silence. The breaking of the larger bones was even more brutal. Peter's forearms were placed on the edge of the wheel and crushed with precise blows. The same was done to his legs, arms, and ribs. With each strike, he roared in pain, but his voice gradually weakened as shock and blood loss began to take their toll. The entire process of breaking his bones lasted over 2 hours. When it was finished, Peter Niers was no longer recognizable as a human being. His body had become a deformed mass of flesh and shattered bones, yet he was still alive, still conscious, still able to feel every second of the agony. The final act was the lighting of the pyre beneath the wheel. The flames slowly licked at Peter's shattered feet and gradually climbed his mutilated body. Even then, even when facing the most horrific death imaginable, he did not beg for forgiveness or plead for mercy. His final moments were marked by the same cold hatred that had characterized his entire life. The execution of Peter Niers lasted nearly 5 hours, from the start of the torture to the moment the flames finally consumed his body. When it was over, his ashes were scattered to the wind to ensure that no remnant of this evil remained. The death of Peter Niers marked the end of a reign of terror in the region. The roads became safe again, families could travel without fear, and the name that had haunted an entire generation became merely a grim memory. But the story of Peter Niers leaves us with disturbing questions about the nature of human evil. How can a person become a monster so completely devoid of humanity? What circumstances turn an orphaned child into a cannibalistic serial killer? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons can we learn from his story to prevent other Peter Nierses from emerging in our world? The answer may lie in the brutality of the time in which he lived, in a society where violence was commonplace, where human life had little value, and where orphaned children were left to their fate. In such a world, someone like Peter Niers was almost inevitable. He was a product of his time, an extreme manifestation of the darkness that resides in the deepest corners of human nature. Today, over 400 years later, the square in Neumarkt is a peaceful place where tourists buy souvenirs and families picnic. Few know that centuries ago, on that same spot, one of the most malevolent men in history met his end on a torture wheel. But if we listen to the wind blowing through the old buildings, we might still hear the echoes of that brutal execution that marked the end of a legend of terror. The story of Peter Niers, the criminal who was burned, mutilated, and crushed by the wheel, remains a grim reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, justice ultimately prevails. Even if that justice comes in the most brutal and primitive form, it still represents the triumph of civilization over barbarity, of light over darkness, of good over absolute evil.